Good afternoon to those who are joining us live, and hello to all who are watching at other times. Welcome to this webinar series titled Reproductive and Economic Justice in the Post-Roe Landscape, Changing the Conversation in Christian Communities. This is the second of 5 webinars, which all take place in the same time slot, Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern from today through October 24th. Our theme of our conversation today is faith-based activism in the post-Roe world. I'm Danielle Timonio-Hansen, and I am the Assistant Professor of Practical Theology and Spiritual Care at Emory University. It's my honor to moderate today's session. These webinars have been designed by a team of scholars and activists who are also moderating our respective sessions under the auspices of the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The Wendland Cook Program is committed to advancing matters of economic and ecological justice, always with a concern for the intersections of oppressions, including racism and patriarchy. We are investigating how religion can become part of the solution rather than remain part of the problem. And we believe that those who are most affected by the pressures of our age are not just victims. They are also agents of mutual liberation, and they model new forms of solidarity. Other sponsors and partners for this webinar series include, in our own voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, the Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, Union Theological Seminary in New York City, Drew Theological School at Drew University, and the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality at Vanderbilt Divinity School. There is also a blog series accompanying these webinars available at the Wendland Cook website, www.religionandjustice.org. Today's webinar is titled Reproductive and Economic Justice in a Post-Roe Landscape, Changing the Conversation about Christian Communities, and we will be focusing on faith-based activism in the post-Roe world. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the resources that faith-based activists use to do their work effectively, as well as how they think theologically about abortion. We will also hear what they believe needs to be done in the current political climate to support women seeking abortions. Before we jump into the conversation, let me explain 2 options for your participation in the live session. Throughout the session, you can post questions using Zoom's Q&A box. In that box, you can also upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. We're aiming to have the last 15 to 20 minutes available for responding to questions. We won't be able to respond to all of them, but we will make an effort to answer those that are most upvoted. You can also post comments using the chat function, though please be aware that the panelists will likely not be responding to the discussion there. After I've introduced the panelists, I welcome you to identify yourself in the chat and share where you're joining us from. Now, let me introduce the esteemed panelists who we're privileged to have in conversation with us today. The Reverend Erika Forbes is the Principal and Visionary Officer of Reproductive Justice Post-Roe. Its mission is to provide the knowledge, tools, skills, and energy required for organizations, private companies, and leaders that believe in reproductive justice to design, build, and implement message, program, and strategy around reproductive justice. Her vision is to have every believer in reproductive justice be a leader in reproductive justice. Jamie Manson is president of Catholics for Choice, where she serves as an advocate and thought leader in areas related to women's reproductive rights and equality in the Roman Catholic Church. She also spent over 12 years as a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, as one of a small number of openly LGBTQ journalists in Catholic media. Her work has earned her more than a dozen awards from the Catholic Press Association. She is also a 3-time winner of the Religious News Writers Association's RNA Award for the Commentary of the Year, as well as the Wilbur Award for the Best Online Religion News Story for her BuzzFeed story, Feminism in Faith. Her activism on behalf of women earned her the Teresa Kane Award for Women of Vision and Courage in 2015. The Reverend Angela Tyler Williams is co-director for movement building at Sacred, also known as the Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity. It is a national alliance of organizers, religious leaders, academics, and congregations working together to advance the cause of reproductive justice through congregational designation and community building programs. Angela is a queer pastor ordained by the Presbyterian Church USA into her call to engage people of faith to speak publicly and politically in support of reproductive health, rights, and justice, and the LGBTQIA+ equality. Finally, the Reverend Katie Zay is an ordained Baptist minister and the Chief Executive Officer of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. The Center for American Progress named her one of their top justice-seeking faith leaders to watch, and she is a member of the Clergy Advocacy Board of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Reverend Katie is the co-host of the Kindreds podcast and the author of 2 books, A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement, and Women Rise Up, Sacred Stories of Resistance for Today's Revolution. I am so honored to be with all 4 of you today and to have this opportunity for some sustained conversation and sharing and discovery. So I want to start by asking you all this question. Faith leaders oftentimes talk about a call to ministry, and we talk about it as a call as a place where people's unique gifts meet a need in the world. And so we know that there is such a need for leaders like you to enter conversations about reproductive justice and act as advocates. So I want to start by asking you all how and why you felt called to engage in this work.
I came off mute, so I guess I'll go. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the Wendland Cook Center for having us on this panel. It is really great to be with all of you. So like my bio said, I am a Presbyterian pastor, and I'm born and raised and grown in the Presbyterian Church USA. And personally, I was always personally and politically pro-choice, but I didn't know what that meant theologically or morally. I never really had to think about it. But I came into this work through the roots of faith-based community organizing. So learning about homelessness and affordable housing in Washington, D.C., learning about climate change in the Philippines, and being in Texas during the Trump administration and getting to see up close and personal the impacts of really awful and inhumane immigration crises. And then coming out in seminary as a queer person and getting to do some work on LGBTQ equality in the Texas legislature. And so I came to that in my last year of seminary, and I was at a workshop actually hosted by Reverend Katie's organization, RCRC. And that is where I learned about the framework of reproductive justice. And reproductive justice is now sort of held by Sister Song, the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, but it was a framework designed by 12 Black women in Chicago in 1994, who came together and said, we need to do a little bit more than just be pro-choice or pro-life or anti-abortion. And we need to talk about actual access to the healthcare that we need. And so the reproductive justice framework holds 4 tenets: the human right to have children, the human right not to have children, the human right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities, and the human right to bodily autonomy. And so when I learned about that framework, everything sort of clicked into place, that all of these other places that I've been doing faith-based organizing around different issues also fit into this umbrella of reproductive justice. And I didn't have to segment off and say, well, this part of me is going to show up here, and this part of me is going to show up here. And so when we are showing up for reproductive justice, we're showing up for all of these intersecting justice issues. And I'm really privileged and honored to be in the struggle with my co-panelists who I get to work with on a pretty regular basis, and to get to keep learning from each other as we all continue the struggle for reproductive justice.
I think we're all used to being called on, so nobody wants to go. So
Okay, I can go ahead and call on folks. Katie, would you like to go next?
I will, since I unmuted myself. It's so good to be with all of you, and thanks everybody for joining in and wanting to be part of this conversation during this time, which has been such a difficult time for all of us, and it has brought opportunities like this one to be in community and conversation together. So that it's always a joy to see my colleagues too. So I received my call to ministry in an abortion clinic. And actually what's really wonderful about this connection is that Danielle was very much part of that, because like Angela, I was introduced to the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice when I was at Yale Divinity School, where Jamie also was. So a little Yale Divinity School reunion happening. And I attended several trainings on how to accompany people through reproductive decision-making. And I actually wanted to use those skills. I didn't want to just learn them in the classroom. I wanted to apply them. And Danielle had this beautiful idea of creating a hotline for people who were post-abortion, who would want to talk to a spiritual leader about anything that they had to talk about. And so we decided, Danielle came to me and said, would you like to help me with that? And what that required was doing relationship building with clinics, because they were very suspicious, understandably so, of seminary students wanting to provide this kind of care. And through that, I developed a relationship with the abortion clinic just down the street from the seminary. I went on a tour, which then turned into a volunteer shift every week, which ended up with me in the abortion room, holding the hands of patients during their procedures. And that really was when I received my call to ministry. It was in offering that pastoral presence, my awkward, inadequate presence of just holding someone's hand and giving them my care in that moment that really felt so sacred to me. And I felt like I have to figure out a way to bridge the divide between the Christians outside who were protesting the clinic, who assumed I was a patient when I went in for the first time, which is a very unsettling experience, which I can talk about more at some point, and the real ministry happening, the sacred work happening within the walls of the clinic, of the staff and the doctors and the nurses who are so caring and compassionate. I just felt like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is why I went to seminary. And I guess the rest is history, because that really is the origin story of this. But for me, it's always been deeply about centering the people who are most impacted and caring for their spiritual needs and making sure that they have access to the care that they need with dignity. I think that that's such an important part of the conversations that we're having right now. It's not just about access. It's about getting access that upholds your whole humanity while you do it.
Thank you. And Katie, I remember those early conversations, and it's really special to be on with you today so many years later. Erika, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Reverend Erika Forbes, and I came to this work on purpose, actually. I am very open about the 2 abortions I had, one at 16 and then one at 18. And as a result of those 2 abortions, it propelled me into volunteering in the early 90s in Operation Escort. And as a result of that, it became a lifelong path for me being involved in reproductive justice, health, and rights work. And I think ultimately what led me to being a person of faith and becoming licensed and ordained as an interfaith minister was to grapple with and answer the question of why there is so much pain and disconnection in the name of religion. And as a result of that, blending those 2 together, of course, not as neatly and orderly as I describe it here, but in a very messy way. What emerged from all of that colliding is the work that I do that is solely focused on reproductive justice, including the focus on working with people who have had abortions or procedures and who are continuing to grapple with it in some way, shape, or form. And then currently working to launch my own firm where I do strategic planning for the next 100 years. And the next 100 years is a result of the decision being handed down, ending the last 50 years. So that is how I got here.
Thanks, Jamie. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just want to add my thanks to the Candler School, to you, Danielle. And again, reiterate, it is a joy to be on a panel with people I work with all the time and the people I went to school with. So I do this work because people are suffering. And people are suffering more often than not at the hands of Catholic doctrine. These concepts of personhood, these concepts of life beginning at conception, these anti-contraception initiatives we're seeing, anti-IVF, is all because of Catholic doctrine. And there are very few people in Catholic spaces willing to talk about it. Even the most progressive, radical Catholics out there, Catholic workers, people who are, throwing their own blood on nuclear reactors, will not touch this issue in Catholic spaces. It is truly the third rail. And that is because punishments for talking about it are swift and severe and deeply ostracizing. And they very often result in excommunication. So, and that's a very humiliating thing to have done. So it's, in many ways, I was already ostracized enough in the Catholic world that I was like, I have no bridges left to burn. It was very freeing, as someone who came out as a lesbian in Catholic spaces in a very unfriendly time. We didn't have marriage, as a law. We didn't have, Pope Benedict was the Pope. So it was a much more unfriendly time for queer people in Catholic spaces. So I had already been used to the, getting uninvited and not being invited to the parties and all of that stuff. So I was very, very happy to take the risk, even though I will say it is very lonely work, being a Catholic doing this. Even people I admire, who have taught me, who have been mentors to me, will not even, do a public event, with me. So it's really important because 1 in 4 abortion patients in this country is Catholic, and the majority of Catholics support abortion rights, the vast majority. And so somebody has to be amplifying and emboldening those folks. And so the work is crucial. Because the institution really is, the originator of this whole movement. And then you've got so many Catholics who support these rights and access, but are afraid to talk about it. And ultimately, the most important thing I like to say is the anti-choice movement is religious. It's not secular. And so faith voices are essential in this movement. And that's something I think the secular, so to speak, reproductive rights movement does not understand, and even our faith voices can be marginalized in those spaces as well. And I keep reminding them, like, you're fighting a religious, movement, or at least a movement that claims a religious identity. you need religious voices to counter that. And so the work is just so urgent. In terms of my origin story, I felt called at age 14 to be a Catholic priest. And so I was immediately in that moment when I started to tell like the priest at my church and my high school teachers and all this exciting thing that I felt this amazing calling from God, I immediately started to experience the illegitimacy of my body in my own church, that I was not, that my very physical form made me incapable of answering my call, made God incapable of working through God was somehow rendered powerless by my body, and so when that's where you start out, and then you come out as a, lesbian, and you're, genderqueer presenting and all of that, you start to realize all of these profound injustices that are all rooted in the same issues. The Catholic understanding of natural law and gender complementarity. And so in many ways, reproductive rights was sort of the next step in the issues that I wanted to embrace and take a stand on, and hopefully find unity, among feminists, among LGBTQ people, and showing them we are all fighting the same Catholic ideology. And if we band together, perhaps we can be a force, to dismantle this destructive white supremacist Christian nationalist movement that is really, really threatening our democracy. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jamie. That actually segues us really nicely into the next question I had, and maybe you want to be the first person to respond. I'd love to hear from all of you. That over the past 50 years, Christians who do not believe in abortion have led what I would describe as a really loud campaign to make the nation believe that the only appropriate Christian theological response to abortion is to be opposed to it. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how each of you think theologically about abortion and what resources you draw upon. And I think one of the gifts of having you all here is that you come from different parts of the Christian tradition. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what does inform your beliefs theologically. So Jamie, since you sort of started to touch upon this, would you be able to answer first?
Sure, I'll try to be as succinct as I can be. It's important to say that Catholic tradition has space for this, has space for a conversation about abortion access. But again, this is an issue that is silenced, stigmatized, and punished if you speak about it. And it's sad because one of the things I love about the Catholic tradition is it has a very rich intellectual side. It used to promote thinking and questioning and theological moral discernment once upon a time. And so we use at Catholics for Choice, we draw upon three parts of our tradition. One is our understanding of conscience. And per individual conscience, which is a very rich idea, again, that God gave us all the gift of reason so we could make moral discernments. And ultimately, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, our individual conscience is the final arbiter in all moral decision making. And so we believe, St. Thomas Aquinas said, to go against your own conscience is to in many ways go against your own human dignity. And so we really believe that as a fundamental truth. The other is religious freedom. This was a notion that was sort of reborn in the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican Council. There was renewed interest in it. There was documents written about it. And good Catholic teaching says that we are to respect religious pluralism. And the fact is, abortion bans and restrictions do not respect religious pluralism. They infringe on the beliefs of others. And so religious freedom is supposed to not only guarantee my freedom to practice my own beliefs, but my freedom to be free of the beliefs of others. And we are seeing profound infringements on the rights, for example, of Jews, of Muslims, of mainline Protestants who do support abortion access, but now are watching as fringe Catholic thought is now being codified into law. And so we want to return to that idea of religious freedom that really is very well thought out, and it respects pluralism in our tradition. And the third one is social justice. I'm glad Angela was speaking earlier about the reproductive justice framework. Catholics have a very rich social justice framework that has a remarkable amount of parallels with the reproductive justice framework. So we really like to take both frameworks and find our mutual strengths. And look, the bottom line is abortion bans and restrictions cause profound suffering to people who are already suffering profoundly from injustices, whether it's racism or economic injustice or terrible immigration laws. Those who are already disproportionately suffering will also suffer disproportionately from these bans and restrictions. And the fact is, the trajectory of a pregnant person's life is determined by these decisions, whether or not to have a child. It impacts whether, their economic outcomes, the well-being of their already existing children's outcomes. It affects whether or not they'll stay with a violent partner. It affects whether or not they can have children later, when they're in a better place. So these are profound issues of social justice that the institutional church refuses to see. So the very people that we're called to serve by this exquisite Catholic idea of preferential option for the poor, those very people we're supposed to serve are the ones suffering the most because of these bans and restrictions.
Thank you. Erika, would you like to speak next?
Sure. I really look at my work at the center of spirituality. And those that have informed me and continue to inform me are who I consider the great mystics and modern day religious leaders, though on the other side of the veil, Dr. King, Dr. Howard Thurman, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin. All have their roots, particularly as African-American people, all have their roots in Christianity, and at different times and spaces helped move the conversation for Blacks in Christianity out of the religious dogma and doctrine and more into how does it look in justice? How does your spirituality, your faith, and your belief take on a different tenor and tone, and yet hold the pieces that traditional Black Christianity has held? And so these mystics, as I call them, and really revolutionaries in the area of religious transformation, are what bind my work together. And several of all of these mystics, their work really frame the justice movement that we see today, whether we're aware of it. And when we talk about reproductive justice, we do currently talk about the 12 founding mothers who were Black women, but really underneath them are these great mystics that hold the keys to unlocking the door on the Black Christian movement around justice now. And so I really use them as the framers for my work, and their evolution, their own personal and individual and contributions to the movement of reproductive justice and justice period, really give me the foundation in which I stand on, and are really the framers, the modern day architects of the justice movement, particularly for the Black Christian church and for reproductive justice in general. So I tend to ask people to look at these authors as examples of where the movement can go for the future. So that's how I would frame it right now.
Thank you. Katie, would you be willing to jump in?
I was raised in a very conservative white evangelical tradition, and what in the South. And what was emphasized to us was reading our Bibles and following the model of who Jesus was. Now, that interpretation was very different when I was growing up, but I think sometimes the key to deconstructing your faith is actually to use the very things that you were taught to use, but turning them on their side. And so when I think about my own theological framework, I go and I look at the story of who Jesus was in Scripture. And many of us know that Jesus does not talk about abortion or many other issues that have become so central to the white Christian nationalist agenda. But what we do see is somebody who was a healer and someone who centered the person in front of him who was in need of healing. And I talk often in my work about the hemorrhaging woman in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, someone who was the catalyst for her own healing, who went beyond the bounds of what was allowed by society, who showed up in a space where she was not allowed, did not follow the customs or the norms, and reached out in faith to be healed. And she catalyzed her own healing in that moment. She changed Jesus's ministry, expanded it beyond what he understood his own power to be, and then healed both herself and the community by telling her whole truth, not just to Jesus, but to the crowd around him. And so when I think about, my own tradition that I grew up in, I say, this is the central story. This is a story of people in need of healing or wholeness or whatever, have a deep knowing within themselves. And I think this is very much the divine that we all have. If we can actually quiet and listen to our own inner voices, which are sometimes very hard to hear, especially for folks entering an abortion clinic who have protesters yelling at them. But I really believe deep down that we all know what we need to be healed, and that Jesus affirms this woman for having done that. And so for me, that story and just stories in general are so central. I shared early on that I had a lot of personal experience of journeying alongside people through their abortion experiences before, during, and after. And for me, that spiritual care of just accompaniment is what I see Jesus doing over and over again in the stories. And I feel like is what we're called to do. And honestly, just talking to people for my book and just in my work in general, people tend to just share their stories with me. And what I know to be true is that abortion is a blessing. Abortion saves people's lives. Abortion is the catalyst for amazing transformation for people. It is essential in every single sense. And so that's all I really need to know. I really refuse to debate the moral good of abortion anymore. I don't find it useful for me, because there is so much work to be done in accompanying the people who are in need of access to care, but also who are healing from the trauma of having grown up in this culture, telling them that what they did was sinful, wrong, murder. There's so much work to be done that I feel like I could spend the rest of my life just doing that work. And so those are the people and the stories that I center in the work that I do, and how I respond to my detractors who claim that what I do is not biblical.
Thank you. Angela, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I just love everyone's answers. This is really great. I think I'm going to sort of tie all of them together in a way that surprises even myself. I'm going to pull on that Wesleyan quadrilateral. All right, we're going to talk about some tradition, experience, scripture. Oh my gosh, now I forgot the last one.
History.
History.
Former United Methodist.
Reason. Great. Let's start with tradition. So in my tradition of the Presbyterian Church USA, in sort of our foundational text, as we talk about who we are and who we understand God to be, one of those first lines is, God alone is Lord of the conscience. And I really see that connecting to what Jamie was talking about in the Catholic doctrine of the primacy of conscience, and that God has gifted us a conscience to know what is right and what is wrong, and to know what is best for our bodies, what is best for our families, what is best for our lives and our futures. And that is so grounding in my tradition and can apply to our reproductive decisions along with totally everything else that we experience in the world. Then I sort of want to get into experience, similar to what Reverend Katie was saying, the experience of hearing people's stories. At Sacred, we talk a lot about weaving together your faith story and your reproductive story. Everyone has a faith story, even if they are not currently a part of a tradition, because we live in a country that is just swimming in religion, even if we don't personally subscribe to it. And everyone has a reproductive story, even if they've never been pregnant or never had children. Folks, we're making reproductive decisions every day of our lives as we decide who our partners will be. How are we going to create family? Will it be through biological means? Will it be creating chosen family? All sorts of different things. And for me as a Christian, it's important to recognize that God is with us at every single part of those decision makings. As we go through our lives, God is there. And so what is it? Who is the God that is with us? We've been told these stories of a shaming, judgmental, wrathful, vengeful God, particularly when it comes to abortion. But I don't think that's what a lot of people are actually experiencing. And I think we've got to rewrite the scripts. So that gets me into scripture. I have been working with Dr. Elizabeth Fries, who I think is watching this panel and will be featured on another webinar soon, on an abortion morality toolkit. And so what is it that we need to do to start rewriting the scripts within Christianity to have something different to fall back on, so that if someone is pregnant, finds out they're pregnant, realizes they want to have an abortion, that their next immediate thought is not, I'm going to hell for this. That is what real folks, and I've heard folks tell me that, and I want them to have a different story that they can tell themselves. Sacred's work really sort of follows in the model of LGBTQ and faith movements that have happened through the past 50 years, working within congregations to tell our stories a little bit more publicly and to recognize that the people in the pews who we have known and loved and grown and formed in our traditions, that we can still love them because we are queer, because we are gay and lesbian. And the same thing is true about people who have had abortions, people who have experienced miscarriages, people who experience infertility, but we don't always hear those stories. And so when looking back to that LGBTQ and faith movement, we also recognize that there's been a lot of work done on sort of the 7 clobber passages, the ones that anti-LGBTQ folks love to bring out and like beat us over the head and say, well, you are sinful because of XYZ thing. And so there's been a lot of work done to counter that. We are still at that place when it comes to abortion and the Bible. And so that is what this abortion morality toolkit is really uncovering. What does the Bible actually say? What are the real messages? Katie talked about, what does Jesus do? How does Jesus respond to people that he meets? But we also need to look at what are the instances in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, that do sort of talk about what happens if you lose a pregnancy. And it's not shame, judgment, and stigma. The message is not abortion is bad at all times for all people in all places, like some folks would like to have us believe. And so we're in that model of like, okay, if not that, then what? So this abortion morality toolkit, really, we start looking at the creation story in Genesis 1-3. And we look at, well, who's actually doing the creating? And is it just God snaps God's fingers and boom, there's earth? Like, we know it happens over time with multiple participants co-creating with God. And if that is really the story that is at the origin, the foundation of our Christian tradition, can that not also be the reality for us now? Can that not also be the story of creating new life in ourselves? Do we also get to say, yes, God, I consent to creating this life with you and with my partner and with my family? Or say, no, God, I do not consent to create this life right now. There's so much more out there. And so we've got a lot more to dig into, and it's going to take a lot to get this message into congregations around the country so we can start writing new stories for ourselves and create and hold space for others to be able to hold those same stories. Because for far too long, it's just been, well, we're not like those folks, and so we just won't talk about it. But we've got to build up our own muscles for compassion and for courage and for creating and holding space for folks to share their stories free from shame, judgment, and stigma.
Thank you. That it really did draw together everything that that all of you were saying before. So I was going to jump in and try to synthesize some ideas, but Angela beat me to it. So thank you. I want to pivot a little to this question of how you take your sense of call and then serve in a public way. And I have two questions about that. So the first is that faith leaders, especially ones who are working in congregational settings, are often working in settings where people in the pews have very different conceptions of reproductive justice. So some faith leaders may feel that they can't speak publicly because they'll face hostility from their congregation, or people will stop pledging and leave, or they'll lose their jobs because there'll be too much backlash from their congregation. And so I'm wondering if these fears have ever been part of your ministry, and how have you addressed them in a way that's allowed you to be authentic to your faith and your sense of call, while also not causing a congregation to become reactive or unable to dialogue with one another. And I think that's such a tender place for individuals who are working in congregational settings. So I'm wondering if you have any wisdom to share about that. Angela, would you want to jump in to start?
Yeah, this is a good question. I will admit that I have not, my experience of this personally is a little bit different because I was ordained into this work, and so have not been on the front lines serving in a pulpit every day, every Sunday, and working, but I work really closely with clergy and pastoral leaders who are really on those front lines. And I'll say, yeah, my experience of that actually came more about speaking out about race and racism than it has about abortion and reproductive justice. And I sort of feel like, and then people know what to expect, like when they're going to ask you to do something, for better or worse. But I'll say at Sacred, we do a lot of work with congregations and trying to move them along in having a conversation and rooting that really in relationship. And it's a particular strategy of both you have to work with clergy and you have to work with lay leaders at the same time. Because if clergy speak out too much, then they're like, oh, I'm going to get backlash from the folks in the pews. And then you have lay folks who say, well, I want us to do this, but I need to get the approval of the clergy person. And so when you've got sort of a key team of leadership working together, then you can say, no, we're sort of a joint force. And I think this work has actually gotten it's more challenging in some situations, but I think it's gotten a lot easier because it is such a public conversation right now, in particular, since Dobbs was heard in December, especially. And so I think that there are people in the pews who haven't necessarily said something before, but are being more willing to be vocal and are pushing their pastors and their priests to speak out a little bit more. At Sacred, we have developed a 7-session curriculum around sacred affirmations and principles and commitments to be designated as a sacred congregation. And it is a 7-session curriculum to really dive deep into our own stories and into the stories of our congregations and of our traditions. And it takes a lot of time because you have to go at the speed of trust and at the speed of relationship. And for so many of us, like for those of us on this call, we talk about these things all the time. But for most folks, they're not really thinking about sex and their bodies and God, and especially in a religious space. And so it brings up a lot of experiences and feelings and stories that haven't always been shared. And so this curriculum helps folks sort of walk through that and journey together and learn together in ways that can create real transformation. And so we can do that inner work so that the next time someone comes forward and says, I've had a miscarriage, or I've had an abortion, or we're experiencing infertility, or any number of those things, then the congregation can show up with compassion, free from shame, judgment, and stigma, and sort of like, oh yeah, we've done that internal work ahead of time. And so we are really excited to keep sharing this with congregations around the country. So right now we've trained about 150 people from 100 congregations from lots of different denominations and states, and there's a real appetite for this. And so it's really exciting to partner with everyone as we are all trying to figure out what to do in this post-Roe world.
I know there's a church near where I am in Georgia that's using that curriculum right now, and I've been hearing great things about it. So it's awesome to hear that's happening. Erika, would you be able to jump in on this question?
Sure. I started an independent church called the Awakening Spiritual Community when I first came to Texas. And in that format, I was able to speak very honestly and publicly about my abortions and about reproductive justice. And so it made it easy to find the congregation and people that were interested and comfortable and wanted to champion reproductive justice. But in my work since that time, I have engaged with lots of clergy, particularly people of color, and particularly men as lead clergy, in being able to discern and draw the connection between having to put a line in the sand about what it means to be a clergy and Christian and fight for justice, and being able to say and help build language and resiliency with clergy in talking to both their congregation, their families, and the community about this is what we stand for and here's why. I would not say that every single topic that a clergy covers is something where you absolutely have to be willing to have the backbone to draw a line. But when we talk about issues of justice and reproductive justice in particular, there has to be absolutism and being comfortable with that, and helping their congregations grow up into being congregations that have the spiritual maturity to handle walking that line with dignity, with fierceness, and with a level of resiliency and absolutism. So that is a different stance oftentimes, because I understand, and certainly it's been my experience as a clergy who spoke from her own pulpit, that there are some things that are worth drawing a line for, and to choose those things, much like Jesus did, carefully and with a sense of resolution. And so that's really how I approach it and continue to approach it, and encourage my clergy siblings to approach it, because we don't have the privilege or luxury oftentimes in these communities for anything different.
Thank you. I want to pivot to a second part of this question of how clergy and faith leaders engage the public, to move us kind of out of the church building per se and into the public sphere. And I know that you all have really significant experience working with the media and speaking publicly about reproductive justice in a climate that can be really hostile, especially to faith leaders who hold a view that might be different from that loud theology that I was mentioning earlier. So I'm curious about what tips you might give to faith leaders who are considering speaking publicly about reproductive justice for the first time. And I'm wondering if I can ask Katie to respond to this question first.
I think some of the fear that you were alluding to in the previous question connected to this one is really rooted in our own internalized abortion stigma that we have to address and work on before we are ready to talk about this publicly. So I think like really thinking about the fact that abortion stigma it functions for a very particular reason, to uphold the white Christian nationalist political agenda. We swim in it, as Angela was saying, about being just inundated with religiosity in this country. Part of that is being inundated with anti-abortion messages. Even if you didn't grow up in a tradition that talked about it, it is everywhere. If you read a news story, you will see, anti-choice signs. It's just part of living in this culture. We have to deal with it just like we do internalized racism and sexism and classism, all of that. We have to recognize it's not our fault that we have it, but it's our responsibility to address it. And so I think before you even consider talking about this publicly in any form, really doing the internal work of what are the values that I have? What have I been taught about this? How do I feel about it? How do I feel about certain situations in which someone might have an abortion? Do I have my own judgments about that? I think getting really crystal clear about your own values is so important to do that work first. I've been pleasantly surprised in the last few months at how many journalists have been so eager to talk to leaders of faith who have a different narrative from what we have often heard. And even with that, I think just being so crystal clear about where you're coming from first is important, so that you feel like you have integrity when people will, because they will, push back on what you say, whether it's the reporter or the people who consume it. And so I think just, again, like we have to do our internal work while we do the external. So I feel like that's my first tip. And also to think about who are the people in your life who are going to hold you when you get the pushback, when you get the critics, or you have people who are trolling you or harassing you online, like making sure you have a soft place to land, whether that's, a friend, your congregation, a group of people, who stand with you. It's really important to have the support around you, so that you have a place to process that, because it really can be quite disorienting and disruptive and traumatizing sometimes, especially the first time that you're speaking about this. So just making sure that you have the social support that you need before you start doing this work. And Sacred has great resources. So does Catholics for Choice. Erika, I'm sure you're developing wonderful, beautiful things too, given your work. And the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice has lots of education. But again, I think it's important to do both pieces, the education work, yes, but the internal values work too at the same time.
Thank you. I know I talk to my students a lot about our embedded beliefs, the beliefs that we've inherited that we might not have even questioned before, and then how that affects the way that we offer care as faith leaders. And so that question of how you reflect on what you've been internalizing, even if it hasn't been intentional, is so important to them be able to turn around and, in any context, be speaking prophetically or offering care. Jamie, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, because you have sat on both sides as both a journalist and as an activist. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on engaging the media, which you know from so many dimensions, and what some tips are that you might give.
Yeah, thanks. This is such a formidable question for me because there will never be a Catholic parish that will be supportive of abortion rights. It has been hard to even get a Catholic nun who have a wonderful legacy of progressive work. You think of the nuns on the bus, for example. Not my issue, they'll say. And so there's a particular I don't know what the word is. The onus is really on Catholics for Choice to create that space that no Catholic institution will ever create. And so, in terms of the media, I think that we did a Catholics for Choice sponsored a panel because I used to be a journalist. I know about this Religion News Writers Association conference that happens once a year, where all the journalists go. Everyone from the small Catholic newsletter to the Washington Post, the religion, editor is there. And so we did a panel of, I think, 5 faith leaders about abortion, speaking about it in a different way. And the response was really breathtaking. And because what the journalists were saying was, we've never heard it spoken about in this way. And this was March. And I told them in my introduction to the panel, I said, this is the issue you're going to be writing about in June. So pay attention right now. And just my biggest frustration with the media is that they make it seem that the only voice is the anti-choice religious voice, that there is no pro-choice, pro-access, pro-abortion religious voice. And so we really push them on that pretty firmly. And I think they've responded well. I'm definitely seeing RNS has really stepped up. Religion News Service has really stepped up. So I think that's a big part of it. We also just got a grant to do media training with faith leaders about abortion. And so we have our first cohort that we're doing in November with about 25 faith leaders. And hopefully that'll be successful enough that we'll continue to get grant money to keep doing that work. And I'm doing that in collaboration with folks at Sacred. And that's going to be very exciting. So I think that the most important thing is we have to take back this narrative. It's so important. I am shocked at how many, I was speaking to a journalist recently who was doing amazing research into the fact that it is Catholic conferences and Catholic bishops conferences that are funding most of the campaigns when there are ballot measures about abortion in different states. It's the Catholic Church that is funding the anti-choice movement. And she said, well, what do you think of that? And I said, well, it's a tragedy because the majority of Catholics support abortion rights. And she said, what? And I said, yeah. I said, you've done all this amazing work and you didn't even realize that 68% of Catholics did not want to see Roe versus Wade struck down. And so I think getting the narrative back is real. The narrative change, culture change work, I think is massive for faith leaders to be doing now. Because we do have the moral high ground in this. I think the anti-choice movement is morally corrupt, especially when they, with their support of Trump. And so there's a real opportunity for us to do it. And I hope more and more people do it because frankly, I think there's safety in numbers. And the more of us that can come forward and be brave about our support for abortion access, the more powerful the movement will become. And that's why it's exciting. Movements like Sacred, there's movement to reboot the clergy consultation service, which existed pre-Roe, a network of faith leaders of all different traditions, helping women get access to safe abortion care when it was not legal. There's a whole new movement there. So I'm hoping we can keep building those networks, so that we have those safe spaces and that, even if you're not going to be the prophetic voice that's going to do this as a faith leader, that you get the support because prophets need support. Everybody knows Martin Luther King did not work in a vacuum. There was a massive community of women and men behind him that made that kind of prophetic work possible. So I think that's really important too.
Thank you. Just a reminder to the folks who are listening and watching that we're going to be pivoting to questions in a few minutes. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, please put it in the Q&A box. And if you want to look at the questions and see what you'd most like to hear asked, you can upvote them in the Q&A box as well. So I want to acknowledge that all of you have developed really amazing networks and programs in your advocacy work. And we know that faith leaders really need to feel supported in their advocacy work and build a network to do it. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more. You've talked a little bit, but if you could talk a bit more about the organizations that you're a part of, that you founded, and how others can become involved. So Erika, would you be able to start with this one?
Sure. I launched Reproductive Justice Post-Roe, which is an online web-based service that inspires individuals to have tools for building resilience to be part of the movement. It also helps provide tools for people who work in the movement. What we know, statistically speaking, is that burnout in the reproductive justice movement is statistically higher than in any of the other justice movements. There's lots of reasons for that. And we also know that many groups historically have been pushed to the margins and not invited or encouraged historically into the reproductive justice movement. I am talking about my fellow cisgendered white men. I'm talking about men, period, not being part of the movement and having a voice and having an opportunity to be fully engaged in this movement. That is not a strategy for the next 100 years. We cannot move forward with that. And then also in our messaging around centering those most marginalized, what has happened is those that aren't most marginalized don't see where they fit in terms of moving the movement forward and building resistance and resilience. Reproductive Just Post-Roe seeks to change that by inviting, encouraging, equipping, establishing these groups that we desperately need for the next 100 years, and giving them tools, not just information about marching and money, but how do we build a movement for the next 100 years? And what does a forever fight for justice look like? And so I started and launched Reproductive Justice Post-Roe the day after the decision was handed down, because to build strength, we must build up and out and invite even those who are, let's say, in question about their choices around reproductive justice into the reproductive justice movement. And when I say that, I mean those that may have had a stance for the last 20 years, but after seeing the events and learning more, I want to move from that place. And so we provide tools and skills to have those people in the movement, and then have those people have the deep, powerful conversations within their sphere of influence, because that's how you grow a movement. And so that's what Reproductive Justice Post-Roe does. And it's an exciting time because I'm hearing more and more from men and from people who never saw themselves as part of the reproductive justice movement or voice coming to the table and needing those tools. So that's what I do.
Thank you. Jamie, can you go ahead and tell us a bit more about Catholics for Choice?
Sure. So we are turning 50 years old next year, which is we're as old as Roe. And so that's very exciting. We've gone through a number of, I think the leaders of Catholics for Choice have always been reading the signs of the times. And so there were times with my predecessor, Francis Kissling, where there was a much more philosophical approach to debating the morality of abortion. After that, I think there was much more of a sense of a research institution that Catholics for Choice was, sort of a think tank. And now I am 17 days out of my 2-year anniversary as president of Catholics for Choice. And my first week on the job, Amy Coney Barrett was in her hearings to become the next Supreme Court justice. And then we had our first unequivocally Catholic president elected a few weeks later. And we had Roe on the chopping block a few months after that. And so I've just read the signs of the times and said, okay, we need to do organizing. We need to do education, community by community, canvassing. This has to come back to its activist roots, which is how it started 50 years ago. And so one of the things that we do is actually I was listening to what Katie was saying earlier so wisely about analyzing one's own internalized stigma about abortion. We've been doing for years something called the values clarification workshops. And they're pretty non-religious. They're more just a series of questions that it's about a 6-hour program that we're trying to actually shorten right now because we want to have much more mass consumption of this workshop. But it's a series of questions that, and scenarios that a small group, max of 30 people, are given to really clarify their thinking around their own personal thinking around abortion. We used to do this mostly in international settings in Uganda, Kenya, and places where we were working internationally, some places in Latin America, but now we've repurposed it for a US context. And so we now see that as a partner to our newest program, which is called the Advocates Bible. And it's for pro-choice Catholics and their co-conspirators. And it's a 150-page manual on how to speak to people of faith, particularly Catholics, about abortion. So it runs the whole gamut of how we make our case for pro-choice Catholicism, the white supremacist roots of the anti-choice movement, our opposition, how to speak to and support someone who's having an abortion, how to lobby. It really is the one-stop shop because we just saw that there is such a not only profound stigma among Catholics around abortion and silence and taboo, but a profound lack of information. And I said, I've got to put something together that actually gives people information. And so that's been exciting. So we started, we did a soft opening, soft launch in March, where I was talking to Catholic progressives discreetly on the down low. I've been talking to Catholic nuns on the down low. It's very, I can't say who any of them are, but it's been exciting. So we've been launching this. We just launched a new series just for our supporters. We've had 550 people signing up for these, so it's really extraordinary. So we have these two. So it's education, and it's that personal discernment and examination of conscience and of values around the issue. So those are sort of the two main things we're doing right now. In addition to all of our media work, and we're putting out a lot of literature for clinics, particularly for Catholics who are coming in, getting harassed outside of a clinic, and giving them, pro-abortion Catholic literature. We made prayer cards with St. Bridget and Hildegard and Our Lady of Guadalupe with prayers in Spanish. Everything's in Spanish and in English. So we're trying to fulfill an educational role and advocacy. We just hired an organizer, and I'm very excited about that. And also do the pastoral work that Catholics are not going to get, which is a tragedy, because so many Catholics are having abortions, and they're trying to participate in the life of a church that tells them they're murderers, and silences them and gives them no support and no voice whatsoever. So that's where we're at right now.
Thank you. Angela, would you be up for telling us some more about Sacred?
Yeah. I'll remind everyone, Sacred is a national alliance of organizers, religious leaders, academics, and congregations working together to advance the cause of reproductive justice through congregational designation and community building. And so what that looks like is Sacred is a pretty new organization. All of these panelists have had a hand in making Sacred what it is today from the very beginnings. Rev Erika and I used to work together on the same staff in Texas, and Reverend Katie was a part of this early conversations figuring out what a national designation was going to look like. But Sacred happened. The Sacred Gathering happened in January of this year, and we brought together 450 people of faith from 40 states, 4 countries, and 30 different religious traditions and denominations. So there is clearly an appetite for people of faith who do support abortion access and reproductive justice to really just come together. And so we gather. We're looking at another Sacred Gathering happening in 2024. As Jamie has said, we are partnering on some media things and really naming that we have got to change the dominant narrative about religion and abortion in this country. We are continuing the work on the congregational designation piece using that 7-session curriculum. If you or your congregation is interested in that, go to sacreddignity.org. I'm pretty sure the link has already been put in the chat. You can sign up to know when our next curriculum trainings are going to be. We're having one a month, October, November, and December. And we're excited to get the curriculum, get folks trained to facilitate it and get it into more congregations. And lastly, we are working on organizing direct support. We didn't really dig too much into the history of the clergy consultation service. which was a network of over 1,500 clergy who from 1967 to 1973 got folks to safe abortion care that they needed before it was legal. We are now in a time that this is needed again. And so we are working actively trying to suss out what the landscape is and what we need for all of these things happening. And again, with lots of people. And that's what Sacred is up to. And we would love to have folks join us for any part that feels good and comfortable and exciting for them.
Thank you. And Katie, can you tell us a bit about RCRC, or the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice?
Thank you for saying the name. And thank you to both Jamie and Angela for talking about the clergy consultation service, because normally I'm the one to talk about that first. And some of the clergy who were involved in that and their denominations started what was then the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights, and we became the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in 1994. So that's a little bit of our history. And we really do look to that legacy of what clergy and faithful lay people were doing. They were doing spiritual care work, they were doing like education work, and they were doing community action work. And so we continue to do that in these times, which looks different and similar to what was going on before Roe. So I want to focus just on the external facing things that people can plug into, because I imagine that's what folks want to hear about. So for one, on the spiritual care piece, we have a website that we developed with Faith in Women, our Mississippi partner, called Abortion's Welcome. It has information about how to access abortion care, legal support, medical support, and practical support. So you can go to abortionswelcome.org. It also has lots of spiritual accompaniment pieces. So we developed pro-choice spiritual care for people before, during, and after abortions, because we know that folks feel very isolated. Often they don't feel like they can go to their spiritual communities. And this way people can access it from wherever they are. So Abortions Welcome is a great website to start. It's a great place to refer people to if they're looking for information about how to access abortion care and looking for spiritual support. We also have, which Elizabeth already linked to several times. Hi, Elizabeth, our Associate Director for the Religion and Repro Learning Center. This is a great place if you are interested in really learning, like, how did we get here? What is this all about? What is the history of how we got here? What do different faith traditions talk about? I think probably all of the panelists have been part of the Learning Center in some way. I know Jamie has done some work with us around the Catholic part of the Learning Center. And also housed in the Learning Center is compassionate care. So if you are looking for how do I actually accompany people, as I was talking about earlier, through the decision-making process, if you're a spiritual leader or not, compassionate care is available both virtually, and we are starting to do it in person again. So if you want to get a group together, we would love to do that with you. We also have a newish series that just launched, the beta, called Sacredly Speaking. That's for faith communities. And actually Elizabeth is part of that as well. How do we talk about these issues? You know, that was something, Danielle, that you said. How do we talk about these things for the first time? So we've got that series as well. So if you're interested, please contact RCRC. And also we have our Spiritual Youth for Reproductive Freedom program, which is actually how I got connected to RCRC when I was a while ago. And Margaret, who's been in the chat, is one of our amazing SURF leaders. We call it SURF, Spiritual Youth for Reproductive Freedom. So if you are on a college campus or even a high school campus, we want to bring SURF chapters wherever folks want to be talking about this among young people, and of course with their teachers and professors too, who are supportive. So I think there was even a question in the chat about engaging younger generations. So our SURF program is one way for young people to be using their voices, because we know that they're most impacted by what's going on. And so it's really important for us to be investing in the leadership that they already bring, but also thinking about them as that next generation of leaders who are going to be leading these organizations and new organizations in the future. So that's a little bit about RCRC's programs. There's a lot more that we're doing. As you heard, we're all small organizations doing a lot of really, really great work. And I'm always impressed hearing my colleagues talk about all the things that we're doing with so little capacity. It's really amazing.
Thank you so much. I'm in awe sitting here just listening to the amount that you do. It's incredible, and it's practical, and makes such a difference, and is so important in our current climate to have these resources available. I want to move us into some questions that were posed from the folks in the audience. One is from Jeremy Posadas. And he asked, what are effective ways to engage or activate what he calls the reachable middle within the churches. And he says that's Christians who don't want to legislate for all women or pregnant people, but who also are uncomfortable with the concept of terminating pregnancies. So he said, how do we meet them where they are, but then lead them to realize they don't have to be pro-termination per se, but should still publicly advocate for choice. Is there anyone who, I feel hesitant to call on you since it's a kind of question straight from the audience that you guys didn't have in advance, but are there any thoughts that any of you would like to jump in with on this one?
Sure, I'll jump in here since it's
great, thanks.
Adjacent to the work that I do. The term reachable middle is a really great term. And I think what I am finding in my work with the reachable middle and those that have not been part of the movement, as I language it, is that being able to feel heard, recognized, acknowledged, and accepted is the sort of, if there's a step ladder, the first step. And what often happens is people in the reachable middle feel, rightly so or not rightly so, that there hasn't been a space for them to be. And so our work is to create that space that is welcoming and affirming, just as we would those that have been marginalized. And being able to reframe our thinking to say, how have we in this movement excluded those people? Is it by lack of conversation, lack of invitation, lack of recognition, or lack of understanding? And then address those really intentionally and succinctly and with a depth of awareness. So that would require humility. Creating programs, building structures, languaging in everything that we do. And when we do that, the next step emerges, which is inviting those that have been welcomed into the space to share their insight, their pain, their joys, and their willingness. Because invitation leads to transformation. And so that's probably the first two steps that I would take.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in with this one?
Yeah, I
Go ahead.
would thank Reverend Forbes for saying that, because it was very good for my heart. Yeah, I think, there has not been a space for people. I think this is like the Catholic par excellence, that I don't find myself pro-life, but I also don't find myself pro-choice, and I don't know where I belong, really. And so these are the folks that we really want to do our programming with, and to create that space. Unfortunately, the pro-choice movement has not been tolerant. It does a lot of gatekeeping around language, and it's not helping. It's not helping the movement. And so, we want to think about how do we, the struggle is, how do you widen your circle without compromising your fundamental values? And that's always a struggle. But we start, exactly as Reverend Forbes is saying, by creating that space of non-judgment and where you can say, I feel like this is a morally complex issue, and be welcome in this space, because it is. It is. People have very different experiences of pregnancy, of gestation, of birth. And you have to be welcoming and honor those experiences, and also have inherited profoundly stigmatizing theology. A lot of deprogramming has to be done. A lot of imagery has to be, reworked in people's minds. Our whole moral imagination has to be expanded around this. So that's what we're trying to do. It's not easy, because Catholics for Choice has this reputation in Catholic spaces of being, pro-abortion and intolerant and, unable to dialogue with. And so it's been a lot of work on our own reputation within our own communities, to say, no, we want to do what our church won't do, and open up a space for dialogue, where there is no space at all inside the walls of our church.
Thank you. We have another question about the state of Texas, and I thought maybe I'd widen it a little to some of the states in general where the trigger bans have popped in or legislation has been passed since the overturning of Roe. And the question is about, it says, I'm in Texas and many of us are eager to act knowing how much suffering is going on. How can we connect with other RJ Christians in the state? Several pastors, including my own, are supportive. We're working now at coming at the issue from our own religious freedom angle as a counter to the official Christian position. So Texas is such a big state. I know both Angela and Erika have experience of living there and engaging the state personally in its legislation. I'm wondering if you could speak to Texas specifically, Angela and Erika.
Rev Erika still lives there, so I'm going to let her go first, and then I will follow up.
Sounds great.
Well, when we think about this, we have to first start at the place of, we're not just talking about the challenge that Texas has, we're talking about the challenges that all states have. And I think first and foremost, one of the ways in which we at Reproductive Justice Post-Roe are doing the work is creating reproductive justice circles. And those circles allow people from any faith or no faith to enter through invitation to dialogue, to grow, to heal, to develop a story, and to practice the tools for direct conversations in their everyday lives. So we're opening these circles, and then those circles become learning centers where then people go and help have conversations, because the work is in the one-on-one, intimate, relational conversations. The change and the transformation and the movement to grow the movement is happening in dialogue. And while marching and money are necessary and big pieces, the everydayness of reproductive justice has to happen and can happen in small group settings and an ongoing dialogue that become embedded in the very DNA and fabric of our daily lives. So that's kind of, think in terms of, and I suggest any organization think in terms of, how do we create small movement circles where dialogue can happen, where transformation and healing can happen, and discussion can happen, and challenge can happen. And then how you take that and help people apply it to their daily lives.
Thank you. Angela, do you want to add into that answer?
Yeah, I'm going to say I made a really good choice in letting Rev Erika go first, because she really teed me up nicely. At Sacred, we are actually just about to roll out some cohorts of people who have already been trained as facilitators in the curriculum, because we know that you need peer support to do this work, because we cannot do it alone. And even though it feels really lonely sometimes, we are not alone. And so we're going to be putting together Google groups of people who have been trained based on, by your state and based on denominations. So to get involved with that, come sign up for a training. That's step one. And it's to build community beyond just what is the hot topic? What's the hot button of the day? What is the news cycle that's trying to react and make us really angry today? We've got to really build relationships with each other. We've got to build trust with each other, because we know that this whole year, the past 5 years have probably taught us, the state is not here to protect us. The courts are not here to protect us. Even some of our institutional churches are not going to protect us. So what are we going to do to really build community and take care of each other and make sure that our needs are met? And what do we have to give, and what do others need, and how can we participate in mutual aid together? And so that happens. The goal for some of these cohorts is that you can be in touch as you're facilitating the curriculum in your congregation. But beyond that, what is it like to be a pastor, a preacher, and you're saying, I'm going to tell my abortion story from the pulpit for the first time. Katie mentioned, like, who are going to be those people that, where do you have that soft place to land after you do something bold and vulnerable and courageous? Who can you turn to for these sort of kitchen cabinet conversations after you are quoted in the media and then the antis come and attack you and you are worried about getting doxxed? You know, how do we build community that is both, it is still a lot virtual because that's where we are, but how do we also get some of that offline connection and relationship building across congregations, across regions? And then, you know, the hope is we've got more folks in a region that are connected, and then we connect those regions to other places in the country to build care and support, because we know it looks really different in a place like Texas or where I am in Arkansas than it does in a place like Illinois or New York or DC or California. And so those realities are going to be different, but we don't have to go through any of it alone.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time, but I think I have time for this one lightning round. So in one sentence or a phrase or less, I'd love for you to just name the most important thing a faith leader can do right now in the post-Roe era that we're living in. So Jamie, could you go first?
Yeah, I think we have to be brave. We have to speak boldly and loudly about, people of faith have got to speak boldly and loudly about our pro-choice values, our pro-abortion values, and change the narrative.
Thank you. Angela, can you go next?
Turn inward. Look at your own life, look at your own story, reflect on it, and learn how to tell your faith and your reproductive story together.
Katie?
Take it slowly. This is going to be work that goes beyond our lifetimes. So pace yourself and also educate yourself about the folks who were already doing this work before you decided that you wanted to get involved.
And Erika?
I would say lean into your faith in a way you've never leaned into it before. You don't have an opportunity to practice faith until you have a reason to practice faith. This is that reason. And if we do that, we will have an opportunity to see how strong our faith actually is.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I am so honored to have been with you today and to have learned alongside you, and to just be inspired by the work that you're doing and the ability that you have to speak about it and galvanize us all to do this important work with our hearts and minds and souls. So thank you. As we come to the end of our time, I want to affirm that though there's much work to be done, we can continue to do it together. And I think that's part of what our speakers today have really reminded us of. So I encourage you to join us again and come together for our next webinar, which is Monday, October 10th at 5 p.m. Eastern and 4 p.m. Central. And that topic is post-Roe reproductive and economic justice, and we'll be covering solidarity. We'd like to invite you to join in the work of your communities and what they're already doing and continue to do in terms of engaging matters of religion and justice. Please check out the websites of our partner organizations, as well as the Wendland Cook Program's website, www.religionandjustice.org, where again, you'll find the blog series that accompanies these webinars, and you'll eventually find the recordings of the webinars as well. We would also like to invite you to sign up for our email list and like us on Facebook. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, Katie Zay, Angela Tyler-Williams, Jamie Manson, and Erika Forbes. And thank you all for joining us today, and please stay in touch. Bye for now.